the topic today. This microphone is on and it's a bit boomy, but I don't know how to turn it off, so let me just have a look here. Hello? No, alright, we'll just live with that. So, today's topic, I guess, is the last in this sequence of issues around directed violent challenges to the African state. So we've looked at issues of resistance and overthrow. Last week we obviously looked at causes and actors in violent conflict. Today we're sort of looking at the more extreme end of this spectrum in terms of failed and collapsed states in Africa. And I think it's fair to say that this sort of topic of collapsed and failed states in the literature, more often than not, has Africa in mind. It is a literature that sort of looks more broadly around the world, but much of it centres on this one continent. Some of you might even be familiar with this thing called the Fragile States Index. It used to be called the Failed States Index, but there was a bit of an outcry about that. And the publishers of this index have tried to soften it by now talking about fragile states. To my mind, that's just as problematic, even if the language is a little bit different. It's published annually by Foreign Policy magazine. If you check the Foreign Policy website, you'll see this index. It also leads every year to a really unfortunate series in foreign policy called Postcards from Hell. You'd think that they might at least try, a slightly friendlier way to package this. So anyway, I looked at their Postcards from Hell this year, which is supposedly listing the 20 most fragile states in the world, and basically saying under no circumstances should our readers travel to these countries. Perhaps it won't come as any surprise to you that 14 out of the top 20 states in the Postcards from Hell are African states, so this gives you a sense of certain continental bias. I worked out that 5 out of the top 20 are places that I was either born in or do my research in these days. None of which I consider to be hellish locations in any sense. That's sort of baffling to me how some of these places get included, but anyway, there's a massive bias in this whole literature about fragile, failed and collapsed states towards Africa. So that's what I'm going to try and unpack a little bit today. What do these terms mean? How are they used in the literature? And why is this literature so obsessed with state fragility in Africa in particular? And obviously, talking about all of these issues today is going to connect back to a whole lot of other things that we talked about, particularly in term 1. So I'm going to try and remind us about some of the theories around state formation and the nature of the state in Africa. And I'm also going to briefly mention some of the things that came up last week in relation to violence and armed conflict in Africa, and kind of build on some of those ideas for today's purposes. The structure of this lecture, you'll be devastated and surprised to know, is going to be theoretical at the start. So 2 sort of sections of theory today, because I want to sketch some of the dominant theories of state failure and state collapse. And then secondly, I want to provide some critiques of some of these dominant ideas. And then I'm going to tie all of that together with a slightly longer case study than normal at the end. That hopefully will illustrate some of the theoretical things that I want to introduce at the outset. So that's where I'm going in this lecture. Okay, so let's start with the dominant theories around state fragility, failed states, and collapsed states. And I think in order to make sense of that, we just have to remind ourselves a little bit of some of the things we talked about around state formation in term 1. Because a lot of the literature on failed states and collapsed states builds on Weber's idea of what an ideal state is supposed to look like. So just to kind of remind ourselves, Weber's theory about state sovereignty emphasises this idea of states having to show that they've got the monopoly on the legitimate use of force on their own territory. That's a kind of key plank of Weber's very well-known theory. And then that is expanded on, this is going way back in the mist of time to, whatever it was, week 4 of term 1. You'll remember that Brownlee and others critique Weber's ideal type of the state and try to expand it out to say that Weber is too narrow, he's expecting states to do too much. And so Brownlee, for example, says that for a state to be a state, it has to have a whole lot of other things, other than just a monopoly over the legitimate use of force. Things like a defined territory, a permanent population, an effective government, some notion of independence from other states, but that states also have the right to enter into relationships with other states. These are the kind of key components of Brownlee's, much broader conception of the state. So Weber's ideas, Brownlee's ideas, which we talked about last term, are basically the basis for the work of two main theorists that I want to highlight today, who talk about failed and collapsed states. The first author is William Zartman, who's on your reading list, and the second one is Robert Rotberg. So two of the kind of principal authors writing on the topic of today's lecture. The key is for Zartman, he's obsessed with the idea of state collapse. This is Zartman's kind of big idea. This is what his whole kind of career, his whole body of work is based around, is trying to theorize what state collapse is and what causes it. He's not so interested in state fragility or state failure, which are the other two terms I'm going to talk about in a moment. But for Zartman, it's all about state collapse. And Zartman's work begins in a very important historical context. And as it so happens, it's the same historical context that gives us the work of people like Kaplan and Huntington, who I've been talking about ad infinitum for about 14 weeks now, and around whom I'm sure you are absolutely sick to death of hearing. But it's important to kind of point out that Zartman is motivated and sort of interested in not only the same time scale, but most of the same cases. Because a lot of his early work is around the wars in Somalia, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Rwanda. So the African conflict in the early 1990s. A particularly violent time of civil war and direct armed challenges to African states. So when I talk about Zartman's ideas, remember that this is the context that his ideas come out of. They don't drop out of the ether, they come out of a very particular context. So for Zartman, his definition of state collapse is as follows. He says that states collapse when the structure and the authority of the legal and political order that makes up the state have fallen apart, have ceased to function in any reasonable way, and must therefore be reconstituted in some form. So for him, it's about the structure and authority of the legal and political order, and that these have kind of fallen apart and basically can't function any longer. And Zartman describes state collapse, quote, as a long-term degenerative disease. His work is kind of replete with all of these medical metaphors. The state is like a body that, erodes in certain ways. And the idea that it's degenerative for Zartman means that it has stages. It means that you don't tend to see states collapse overnight. It tends to be a slow process with various identifiable stages. And so for that reason, Zartman highlights 5 warning signs of state collapse. This is how you know that states are on the brink of falling apart. That their legal and political authority and any sense of order within the state is about to disintegrate. You should be looking for the 5 following things. Firstly, Zartman says, you would expect to see power shift from the core of the state to the periphery. And this usually goes along with some kind of infighting within the state. So that you get state actors in the centre and state actors on the periphery arguing with one another, failing to coordinate and sometimes even violently clashing with one another. But the key is that you should expect power to shift to the periphery. Secondly, Zartman said,